Hi and welcome to Shorts in Psychology. The purpose of this video is to explain how to answer extended response questions as well as understand how the marks are allocated. So what are extended response questions? As the word extended response implies, it means that you need to have at least a page of writing. We're not just writing down one or two well-described ideas that are worth 2 or 4 marks. However, these questions are not essay questions, so therefore you shouldn't be writing any introduction or conclusion and should simply be addressing the dot points. So for these questions, you should be spending about 15 minutes answering them, and in the exam at the end of the year, you will have 2 extended response questions that you will have to answer for a total of 40 marks. So for each question, how are the marks allocated? The content is worth 16 marks, and this is evenly distributed between the dot points in the question, with the remaining 4 marks being for communication, giving you a total of 20. So let's look at some examples of how the content mark allocation works. Most of the time you will get extended response questions with 4 dot points, which means 16 divided by 4, each dot point is worth 4 marks. So that means that you need to have 2 well-described and connected ideas for each of the dot points. Again, no introduction and conclusion, you simply address the dot points, aiming to have at least a page of writing. Sometimes though you will get extended response questions that only have 2 dot points, such as this one. So in this instance they're worth 8 marks each, which means for each of those dot points where the trait and humanistic theories of personality are being described, you need to have 4 well described and connected ideas. Let's look at how the communication marks are allocated. Answers need to be clear and well expressed. So 1 mark is for clarity, which means that the response doesn't need to be read several times. It flows, it's in a logical sequence, and it's easy to understand. The second communication mark is for relevance. So while it is an extended response and you're elaborating on your ideas, the ideas discussed should be directly related to the dot points. So if you're asked to describe a qualitative design and you describe all 3 design types, including experimental and quantitative observational, you would lose the relevance communication mark, because while you're describing design types, a lot of the information that you're giving isn't directly linked to the dot points in question. The third communication mark is for structure. So the extended response answers need to be in proper sentences with correct use of punctuation, and they need to be in paragraphs. So I would recommend that you have each dot point in its own paragraph, and if you want to use headings here, that's perfectly fine. You shouldn't have any dot points in your extended response. The only exception to that would probably be if you were listing a process or a procedure, or numbered steps for things such as systematic desensitization. That's probably okay, but generally you need to be writing in complete sentences. The fourth and final communication mark is for effective use of psychological terms. Your response should read as though you have actually studied psychology and you're not just explaining it to the friend next to you. It's not just using terms correctly but also effectively and not mixing them up. So for example, if you're discussing a validity issue, making sure that you're using the term validity or the correct type of validity, internal or external, instead of confusing it, for example, with reliability. It's also things like not using abbreviations, so writing independent variable as opposed to just IV. We'll finish off by looking at, well, how can we actually answer extended response questions? Because to start with, they can be a little bit intimidating, and so we'll go through how to tackle them. So the first step, of course, is to read through the scenario and highlight key phrases in the scenario. Even when you're doing your exam at the end of the year, which is electronic, you have a highlight tool. You will always be able to highlight key parts of the question to help you identify what information you're going to use in your response to support your conclusions. You don't have to address the dot points in order in your answer. You just have to make sure that your paragraphs flow from one another. Again, if you want to use headings to help you sequence it and to boost the flow of your response, that's absolutely fine. In your response, you want to define and describe the points, showing your knowledge of psychology, and make sure that you also relate them to the scenario. If you only define and describe points without putting it in the context of the scenario, you will only generally get at most half the allocated marks. So to finish, let's have a go at an extended response question that fits under the Introduction to Psychology topic. So pause the video for a minute while you read this scenario, look at the data and have a go at this extended response question. So I'm going to go through how to answer the first dot point. So if we examine what the first dot point is actually asking, we can see that it's asking for two factors that would make this an experimental design. So before we break that down a bit more, I'll just say at this point that highlighting and carefully reading the dot points as well as the scenario is incredibly important, because it's quite common for students to misinterpret the dot point and then as a result of that not receive marks in their answer because they have not actually understood what is being asked. So if we look at this one, we're being asked for two factors that would make this an experimental design. So the two factors, that's the Introduction to Psychology content. That's where you're showing your knowledge and understanding of elements, characteristics of the experimental design type. That content is worth 2 out of the 4 marks here, and so the other 2 marks are for the context. So it's what would make this an experimental design. So that's where we have to use the information that we have here in the question. So I'm going to go through 3 potential factors that you could use in your answer here. So the first thing that we're told in the first paragraph is that the psychologist was interested in the effects of assembling a jigsaw puzzle on high school students. So one element of an experimental design is that the independent variable is deliberately manipulated by the researcher. That's our content mark. And then our context mark is to say in this investigation, what was manipulated was the assembly of the jigsaw puzzle. And if we wanted to link that to the effect on the dependent variable, we would say in this case, we're wanting to see the effect of the jigsaw puzzle on heart rate and on the anxiety questionnaire scores. Those two measures are the dependent variable in this scenario. The second factor we could discuss is the use of random allocation, because we're told that this sample of 100 students was split randomly. So again, we'll start with our content. Random allocation is assigning participants to the control and experimental groups using chance. In this investigation, the sample of 100 students were split randomly into 2 equal-sized groups. And you could elaborate if you wanted a bit more depth to your answer. You could also explain, well, why is random allocation used? It's to try and ensure that extraneous variables are equally distributed between the groups. It's to prevent experimenter bias from having an impact on who goes into which group. The third factor that could be used in an answer here is talking about the presence of a control group, because we're told that one group assembled the jigsaw puzzle for 10 minutes, but we also had a group of students that sat in silence in a separate area and did not assemble a jigsaw puzzle. So our content, what is a control group? It's where the independent variable is absent, so no treatment is given, and this provides a baseline for comparison in order to observe whether the independent variable has had an effect on the dependent variable. So in this investigation, the control group are the students sitting in silence in a separate area that don't assemble the jigsaw puzzle. And that allows us to see that it is the jigsaw puzzle that has influenced heart rate and anxiety questionnaire and not a different factor, because if both groups had a change in their heart rate and their anxiety scores, we would know that that change is not as a result of the jigsaw. It has to be something else because the control group didn't assemble the jigsaw. Hopefully this video has made extended response seem a little bit less intimidating and helped you feel more confident about how to answer them and understand how they're marked. Good luck practicing extended response questions, and thank you for listening.